I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the land of Egypt in our continuing study of ancient history as a framework for the Bible. If you look at a map of modern-day Egypt, we have these relatively nice, straight latitude and longitudinal lines. It looks like a big square, at least to the west and to the south. But that was not the way they pictured ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt was the land along the Nile River. You could actually say that the Nile River made the land of Egypt. It made it into an agricultural nation. In fact, later on in the Roman days, Egypt would be described as the breadbasket of the world, and what made it that was the Nile River. Other than the Nile, without the Nile, the land of Egypt would have been an entire desert. It would have been a part of the Sahara Desert. But this river brought life to that part of the land. You see, the river flooded every year, and it flooded pretty much like clockwork. At a certain point in the year, as the snows far to the south, 4,000 miles to the south, would melt in the mountains in southern Africa, that melting snows would cause the river to rise, and as it moved forward, as it moved northward all the way to where it empties in the Mediterranean, it would bring rich soil deposits that would be scattered and left in the Nile River Valley. And land values were set by how well those lands were flooded, because lots of flooding, lots of topsoil left there each year would increase the crops and bring a wonderful fertility to this part of the land. It also joined the country together. The Nile is navigable, that is, you can take either a rowboat or even quite a large vessel and sail up and down it from the Mediterranean all the way to the first cataract. You get to a certain point, it would actually be off our map here, but you get a certain point in the south and you begin to find a series of waterfalls. There's one, and then you go quite a number of miles further south, and there's another, and there's a number of waterfalls way down south that tend to break up that navigation. And if you want to get past, you've got to pull your boat out of the water and drag it uphill and then put it back in the water upstream. But it unified this whole section of Egypt in a wonderful way. It brought unity and transportation. In fact, they would move not just agriculture, but you've seen examples of some of the stonework. Sometimes those great stones would be moved up and down the river as well. So the Nile River is down in a valley. As you look in the distance, you can see the escarpment and the level of the desert. That's not a series of mountains in the distance. That's actually the level of the desert beyond. If you're down in the Nile River Valley, it's lush, it's fertile. As soon as you get past the point where it floods, now you're out in the desert. And the transition is that fast. The desert doesn't, the fertile area doesn't peter out gradually. You just take one step, you're out of the fertile area, you're out of Egypt, and you're now in the desert. Now, I want to talk a bit about the name of Egypt. This is an aerial view. You can again see the Nile River Valley, the delta as it enters into the Mediterranean, and there's a couple of oasis areas that are also fed by the Nile. The land of Egypt, we call it Egypt. And the reason we call it Egypt, no Egyptian ever called it that. There were some Greek tourists who came to this place. They came to the city of Memphis, and the ancient city of Memphis was called Hakupta. And they didn't speak much Egyptian, and the Egyptians didn't speak much Greek, but they sort of asked the question, what do you call this place? And the Egyptians said, well, it's Hakupta. And they said, oh, this, and they mispronounced it. Sort of like when I go to a foreign country, I try, but I mispronounce things. And they ended up calling it Hakupta. Well, it sounds a little bit like Agipta. And so they wrote it down, and they said, okay, this must be the land of Agipta. Now, they thought it was the entire land. The Egyptians were saying, no, it's just this town, this city. But the name stuck. And so the Greeks called this place Agipta, and that's how we get the word Egypt. It's from the Greeks' mispronunciation of a town. Now, the Hebrews called this land Mitzrayim, just the people of Masir. And that name sticks even today. If you go to Egypt today, they will call it Masir in Arabic. But the Egyptians called this land Kemet. Now, when I say that, it sounds sort of funny because, and notice I just wrote the consonants. That's because, like Hebrew, so also in Egyptian, you don't write the vowels. You understand those, but you just write the consonants. So Kemet is what they referred to it. And the word Kemet means the black land. And that's in opposition, in contrast to the red land. You see, the black land is what you see here. The fertile land, that's the land with the rich topsoil that's deposited by the flooding of the Nile. And the red land is all the land around that. That is the desert land they refer to as the red land. So there's a sense in which you can look at Egypt as the black land and the red land. The black land is the Egypt part, and the red land that's getting away from Egypt. That's out there. That's the desert regions. So the Nile brought life to Egypt. This river made it an agricultural economy, both in growing supplies and in cattle and in feeding livestock and feeding the people. And as it wound its way north, this became a center of civilization because it's placed here amidst the desert. You didn't have a lot of invaders coming across the desert. Egypt's rather a hard place to get to. You're either going to get to it from the north or the south, that is via the Nile, or you're going to come across the desert, and that protects it. The desert is like a wall protecting the land of Egypt. So yes, occasionally we'll see invasions, but it's not at all going to be like what we saw in Mesopotamia, where there's always a new invading group coming in from one direction or the other direction. That happens fairly rarely in the land of Egypt, which will allow Egypt to have much more of a consistency in its civilization. And so the Nile, we could say, is the gift of Egypt. It brings life, transportation, so much so that the Nile was worshipped as though it were a god. Now, if we're contrasting Mesopotamia versus Egypt, in Mesopotamia we do have flooding with the Tigris and Euphrates River, but that flooding is irregular and destructive. In Egypt, the flooding is predictable and it's beneficial. It's a good thing. They want it to flood. They know it's coming at just the right time. It floods. It doesn't flood in a raging flood. The water just gradually rises. And they even use it for construction purposes. At times they would actually take, they say, we have these big blocks that we need to move way up here, but flood's coming pretty soon, so we'll just put a raft under, put a bunch of wood under it. The flood would come and it would raise up that building block and they just shove it into place. And so the flooding was predictable but also beneficial. In Mesopotamia there were no natural borders against enemies. In Egypt the natural borders are the sea and the desert. Those borders protect the land of Egypt. In Mesopotamia, they had rulers of all sorts of different nationalities coming through. That will not happen very often in Egypt. In Egypt, it will be mostly a dynastic succession. And so there's a series of dynasties, nearly all of them Egyptian. There will be a few exceptions, we'll see those, but mostly it's going to be a dynastic succession. In Mesopotamia, the outlook of the people often seems to be a little bit more pessimistic. In Egypt, they're more of a land of optimists, although we will have a season of pessimistic literature. In Mesopotamia, the gods were thought of as cruel and cold and not to be trusted. They might, turn and bite you. In Egypt, the gods were seen as good and benevolent. Now, some problems that we face in studying Egyptian chronology. First of all, the lack of a fixed system of reckoning years. Today we say that it's the year 2014 or, whatever year that it happens to be. They did not have that. Instead, they would say it might be the second year of Amenemhet And you'd say, well, gee, well, that helps if I know when Amenemhet lived. And it also helps if I know which Amenemhet of which I am speaking, because there might have been several, there were actually a number of different pharaohs named Amenemhet. Which one are we speaking of? And so that can make it very difficult in trying to determine Egyptian chronology. Now, there are some helps. One of the helps is, and one of the problems still, let me talk about the problems first. The Egyptians did not have any objective historians. Throughout the history of Egypt, the idea of writing history as history just never really seemed to take off. It's not until at the end of Egyptian history we're going to see Greeks come. We'll see Alexander the Great, he'll come into Egypt, and after his death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, will sort of grab Egypt and rule over Egypt and set up a dynastic succession of Greeks. And it's only when the Greeks are ruling Egypt that Greeks have this idea of writing history. Remember Herodotus, he was a Greek, he was the father of history. And it's as the Greeks take over Egypt that a Egyptian with this Greek influence now will set out to write a history of Egypt. In fact, he's going to be the one that sort of sets out, here's all the dynasties of Egypt, and explains, what's happened there. So it's not until the Greeks come into Egypt that we have Egyptian historians. And so they're going to be writing much later after the fact. And that gives us a second problem. Now, the good news is that there are some astronomical dating helps that the Egyptians they were record keepers. They weren't historians, but they did keep records, and they were very aware of various astronomical data. Now, they had a year that was 365 days. That's quite astounding. They had a year that was exactly or almost exactly. Now, one thing they did not have was a leap year, and as you know, a year isn't exactly 365 days. Every fourth year you need to throw in a leap year, or your calendar is going to be off by 1 day every 4 years. And in that same way, the Egyptian calendar was off 1 day every 4 years, and they knew it, but they did not correct it. So they would allow it to go, and then 4 years later it's going to be off by 2 days, and 4 years after that it's going to be off by 3 days. Which means, do the math, 365 times 4 is 1,400 some odd, I don't remember the exact number, that over a period of 1,400 years, it's going to take 1,400 plus years for the calendar to make a full circle before it's back on track for that 1 year, and then it's going to start going off track again. And the Egyptians knew that, and they had recorded that there was one time every 1,400 some odd years where a certain star would rise at the beginning at their new year, where Sirius, the dog star, would rise at the beginning of the year. And they recorded that. And that helps us to take the Egyptian chronology, such as it existed, and cement it into place using that astronomical data. However, there's still a problem. You say, well, there shouldn't be a problem there. Astronomy, we can figure out exactly where everything was. Well, the problem is we don't know exactly from where those astronomical observations were made. Were they made way down south in southern Egypt, that is, in the city of Thebes? Or were they made in the northern part of Egypt, that is at Memphis, the early capital of Egypt? Which place were they? And that's going to give you a difference of around 22 years, something like that. And so what we have in Egypt, in Egyptian chronology, even among the scholars, and they argue about it, is a early date and a late date, and the difference is around 20 to 22 years. Now, I've just picked one. It's not totally arbitrary. I have some good reasons, but I'm not going to try to convince you either way. I'm just going to tell you that my dates, if you look at the dates that I'm going to be using and the dates of some Egyptian history books, there'll be a discrepancy, and that's why it's there. So I want you to be aware of that. a discrepancy usually of around 20 to 25 years, something like that. Now, the fourth issue, translating the hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs, and we don't want to call them hieroglyphics because that's not really a word, that's more of an adjective. They are called hieroglyphs, and the hieroglyphs were not translated until, in modern times, until after there'd been a discovery called the Rosetta Stone. That was a big deal. And we're going to come to that in a bit, but first let's talk about Egyptian history. We have, first of all, the Archaic period. Now, there may have been Egyptians around before that. By Archaic period, I'm going to be speaking specifically of the beginning of the Egyptian dynasties. That is, at this point, I begin to have people ruling Egypt where the later Greek and Egyptian historians looking back would say that's where Egyptian history begins. That's not to say nobody was ever there before. But now we begin to have recorded history, and Egypt becomes a nation where both northern Egypt and southern Egypt, and I'm going to tell you how we're going to describe those in the future, but we're not quite there yet. That's the Archaic period. And that's followed by the Old Kingdom. Now the Old Kingdom will be dynasties 3 through 6. So the Archaic period has the first two dynasties. And then in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties, that is, and the dates I'm giving from around 2686 to around 2181, and remember you've got to give me a little bit of wiggle room there. But in those dates, in the 3rd millennia before Christ, this is all before Christ, this is all BC, this is when I have the pyramids being built. This is the pyramid era. All of the pyramids, or almost all of them, there's maybe a few that are built a bit later, but nearly all the pyramids are built during this period, including the Great Pyramid, including the early pyramids like the Step Pyramid, including some of the later ones that we've almost lost track of some. In fact, we every once in a while we find a new pyramid. There's about 100 pyramids throughout Egypt, and they are built during this period, during the Old Kingdom. After that, things sort of fall apart, and you have what we call, now they didn't call it this, is what we call it. We call it the first intermediate period, first because there's going to be others. The first intermediate period where rulership and just things in Egypt tend to go downhill, and they fall apart, and Egypt is not united during this period. It's divided mostly into North and South. And then after that, things come back together for dynasty number 11 and dynasty 12. The dates here, 1991 to 1786 BC. And it's during this time, during the Middle Kingdom time, that Abraham, remember in Genesis chapter 12, we talk about how Abraham, he's come to Canaan, and then for a brief time he comes down to Egypt, and he does that thing, she's not my wife, she's my sister. That's during the Middle Kingdom. And likewise, later on in the book of Genesis, we read how Joseph is sold into slavery and he's taken down to Egypt, and there he rises to prominence where he's the number 2 man in the kingdom. And that again is during the Middle Kingdom period. So this is the era of the biblical patriarchs, even up to the point of Joseph, and the Israelites are allowed to come in and they settle in Egypt. We'll look at that. They settle in the land of Goshen, that is around the delta of the Nile in northern Egypt. But after that, things are again going to fall apart, and we will have a second intermediate period. And really what happens here is some outside invaders. And it's interesting, just like the Israelites who go down into Egypt, they are Semitic peoples. They are not the only Semitic peoples that come down into Egypt. Another group come down, known to us as the Hyksos, and they will actually take over Egypt, at least the northern part of Egypt. They will take over. Southern Egypt really won't go along with that. But you're going to have this second intermediate period where, again, Egypt is not united. And the Hyksos will eventually be driven out by the 18th dynasty, who establish the New Kingdom. So I have Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. Remember, they didn't call it that. We look at that in hindsight. And it's during this period where we're going to see Moses and the Exodus. That will be during Egypt of the New Kingdom. Now, exactly when that takes place, even Bible scholars have some debate over that. And I'm going to give you my opinion, and I'll explain some of the others as well that frankly, I think are wrong. But they all agree it's during the New Kingdom that Moses is born and we have the Exodus. And then after that, you guessed it, we're going to have a third intermediate period. Now, because it's an intermediate period, there's more that happens after that. But Egypt, after that, well, we're not going to call it the newer kingdom. We're going to give it other names. And we'll get to there. We probably won't get there in this lecture, but we'll come back and see more of Egypt in a future lecture. But for the time being, let's go with this. Egypt, then, we have to talk about, I've been calling it northern and southern Egypt, but I have to refer to it because usually they will refer to it as Lower Egypt. Now, Lower Egypt, you would think on a map, lower would be, like down at the bottom of the map, because our maps are usually oriented with the north to the top and the south, the bottom to the south. First of all, Egypt didn't even think that way. If they were orienting the map, they probably would have put east on top. And we'll look a little bit later as to why that might be the case. But Lower Egypt was geographically lower. That is, it was down lower to sea level. And that's in the north. That's the Delta region in the north. And then Upper Egypt is that part to the south. It's just physically a little higher. And we have to remember that. When you hear Upper Egypt, don't think north. Don't think the top of the map. But Upper Egypt is down in the is south. Sorry to say down. Shouldn't say that. Upper Egypt is in the south. Lower Egypt is in the north. And the pharaohs actually wore different crowns. The pharaoh of Lower Egypt wore a red crown. It had, notice that little curly Q thing coming out of the front of it. It looked like a papyri reed. That's what it represented, because in the north, in Lower Egypt, you have the delta marshes, and that's where the papyri grow. They grow in the delta region. And so his crown, his red crown, reflected that. Meanwhile, the pharaoh in the south, he wore a different kind of crown. He wore a white crown. I'm told that it represented maybe a tulip. Can't say for sure. But different shape and different color. Now we have the Narmer Pallet. It reflects one of the earliest pharaohs of whom we know. In fact, he's thought of. He was known by the Greeks as Pharaoh Menes. Narmer, and when I say pallet, it was actually designed probably to hold what do you call it? Makeup. Certain pigments and things that somebody would put on their face. When we see the flip side, we're going to see a place where you would sort of put the makeup, the pigments, and sort of mix them. But it was a ceremonial sort of thing. And it commemorated, notice on this side, I'm going to flip it over in just a minute. On this side, you have a picture of Pharaoh Narmer. And he's in the position of striking and smiting. He's got a club over his hand, and he's got his hand in the hair of an enemy. In this case, the enemy has Semitic features. That is, he's got a beard. And now you say, well, wait a minute, Pharaoh Narmer has a beard, but Narmer's is a ceremonial beard. That's a strap holding on like a fake beard. And he's in this position of striking the enemies, and then down under his feet are those enemies that he's already slain. And it is King Narmer, Pharaoh Narmer, who unifies northern and southern Egypt. So he comes from the south. He comes from Upper Egypt. And how do you know? He's wearing the crown of Upper Egypt. But notice when we flip it over, the war is now over, and now there is a time of peace. And you see the Pharaoh, he's in the upper half of the pallet. And this time he is wearing the red crown. You can see the papyri part of that crown. So he takes those crowns, and we will eventually see pharaohs that wear one crown that combine the elements of both the red and the white crown. Both the colors as well as the shape will be combined into a single crown. Now, we next have the Old Kingdom then, beginning with the 3rd dynasty. We said we give dates 2666, around there, to 2161. And one of the things that we note, because this comes to the forefront when we get to the pyramids, are the burial practices specifically of the king. You know, normally in the ancient world, you buried somebody, you just dig a hole in the ground, put the body in, maybe put some rocks on to, over the top to stop animals from digging them up, and you're done. But the king got a special burial pit. They dug a deep hole, still buried him in it, but then they built a structure around it, a mastaba. Here's a modern-day mastaba. The word mastaba isn't a word that the Egyptians used in ancient times. That's the Arabic word that means bench. It's like a big giant bench setting. You know, you could imagine a giant coming on, sitting up, propping his feet up. But it was a tomb. And the early Egyptians, for their rulers, they built this sort of elaborate tomb. Until we have the Pharaoh Dozier, who builds a mastaba and then builds another mastaba on top of the previous mastaba, and then another mastaba on top of that, and it's like a layer cake. This giant, well, I'm calling it a pyramid, but it's called the step pyramid. What it is a series of those mastabas. And this is the first stone structure, as far as we know, in Egypt. Before that, various building supplies might be mud brick, or it might be wood. In fact, they probably used had to transport the wood because there's not a lot of wood down there in Egypt. But they were now switching to stone. And so this step pyramid became the first pyramid. Now, it's not a true pyramid, but it was this idea of mastabas on top of mastabas on top of mastabas. And you can tell that they were used to working with wood when you look at the entry. We have a series of columns as we're going toward that step pyramid, and these columns are made of stone, but notice how they are shaped. They are shaped to look like they are wooden poles all bound together. Apparently that's what they'd been using for columns at a previous time, and then they would perhaps have a wooden ceiling. But here are the columns. Now these are stone columns, but they are cut and shaped to make them look like wood. And likewise, when you look at the roof, and this is a section of the roof, it looks like I have wooden beams, but that's not wood. Those are stones that are cut and shaped to look like wood. So they had the familiar cut and shape, but now it's being built of stone. Now, next we have Snefru. He's another pharaoh, and he sets out to try to build a true pyramid. And he gets about halfway up, and they begin to have problems. The foundation was not adequate. You notice when I look at the corners, the corners have sort of crumbled, and the entire pyramid was in danger of just crumbling and falling. And so, about little less than halfway up, they changed the slant to give it that bent look. Here on the left, notice you can see in the distance the bent pyramid. To the right, we see the red pyramid. That's a true pyramid. Notice there's another one in the foreground, just in front of the bent pyramid, a much more graduated slant to it, a less extreme angle. Because the problem with a pyramid, these great structures could be so heavy that weight would just drive the pyramid apart until someone got the idea of building an interior opening that would redistribute the weight, where it would not all be upon just one set of rocks, so as to crush them and pulverize them and bring the entire structure down. Our greatest pyramid, in fact, that's what we call it, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, or if you're, the Greeks called him Cheops, but we'll go on with Khufu. And this is on the Giza Plateau near Cairo. It's just on the west side of Cairo. In fact, all the pyramids are to the west, on the west side of the Nile River. But the Great Pyramid of Khufu, something like 480 feet high. A huge, huge structure. This would take years to build. Now, it doesn't take any real high math. You know, it's not like, an intricate. Rather, it's basic. Just putting one stone on another. And yet, on the interior, you are going to have some special work taken so that it would not collapse, and it still stands today. These pyramids were old. They were already ancient when Abraham came to Egypt, because remember, this is Old Kingdom Egypt. There are 3 large pyramids, and then some that are not quite so large, some smaller pyramids. They're on the Giza Plateau. When you see the stone, when you get up close, when you see a picture from far away, you don't get any sense of how huge these things are until you get up close and you see the size of the individual stones, and then you realize how many millions of stones are assembled and dragged up here. Now, the stones were quarried in the area. It's not like they moved them down from hundreds of miles away. No, they were quarried in the area, but then it was assembled here, and certainly a majestic work. As we said, we have some internal chambers. The chambers go in at a slant, and the pyramid served as a tomb, so that after it was constructed, the entryway would be sealed up, and sealed up so as to be hidden, so that you would not know where the entryway was. And then inside the pyramid, initially you have noticed the descending passages. They may have initially thought to bury the king down underground, in just like the old mastaba, but instead we have the king's chamber. It's way up high in the body of the pyramid, and and then it would have stone slabs that would be, once the king had been placed there in his sarcophagus. By the way, the sarcophagus is bigger than the entryway, which means that they built the sarcophagus and placed it there as they were making the pyramid. They didn't put it there after the fact. They placed the king in there, probably amidst all sorts of riches and so on. When later explorers finally broke into the pyramid, and they had to break in, the entryway had been sealed up so as to prevent people from meddling with the pyramid. But to get in, there were those who dug a entryway. Here you're looking at the entryway that was originally designed, but down below where these people are standing, they have what's known as the Robber's Tunnel, a tunnel that had been cut into the pyramid in order to gain access. That's the way, if you're going to visit the pyramid today, you usually go in through the Robber's Tunnel. They got in, and the pyramid had already been looted. That was the case with nearly every pyramid. They had already been looted. By whom? Well, probably by the very folks that built the pyramid. After all, if you're building this pyramid and then you see all the riches that are being stored there, then maybe you come a couple of nights later and you break in, because you know where all the doors are. You break in, you steal it, and you leave. So when they finally did break into the pyramid, it had already been looted. again, a picture of the robber's tunnel and the main entrance that had been sealed up and hidden at an earlier date. Now it's been uncovered. Now, nearby, we were looking at the Great Pyramid before, but there is also the Pyramid of Khafre, and he was the son of Khufu, and his pyramid, it was about 20 feet small, 20 feet shorter, still huge. You know, as you look at them, it's hard to tell that one's bigger than the other. Probably made it just a bit smaller out of respect from his father. I like to think that's the case anyway. But notice in this pyramid, you have the upper third has a white limestone, very smooth, relatively smooth, facing. And it's not that it was designed just like that. The entire pyramid, both of these pyramids originally were covered with very smooth sheets of limestone. So that instead of having those steps that you could go up, it would be completely smooth, looking like a giant diamond that had dropped out of heaven. You say, well, where did all the limestone go? Well, when you go into Cairo, you're going to find all of these mosques and things like that, and they're all made of limestone. It's because all of those building materials were pulled off the pyramid to build up all these different structures in Cairo. But originally, they were so smooth and so white that in the sun, to look at them would blind you. The other thing when we look at the pyramids, we see out in front of the pyramid the Sphinx. This is a statue of a lion's body topped with the head of a man, probably topped with the head of Khufu, or maybe his son. And between the paws, we're going to come back and talk about that a bit later. You have an inscription. That's a much later inscription. That wasn't placed here at this time. It was placed here by one of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. And that's going to be very significant, not just to Egypt, to our story of the Bible. We're going to see how significant that is. But we have this great statue. What happened is, as they were building the causeway to the out to the Nile, that would serve as the mortuary temple for these pharaohs, they found this large, heavy stone escarpment, and they said, "Well, what are we going to do with this? This is just going to be really hard to move." And they, instead of moving it or cutting it out, they used it and they fashioned it into this elaborate figure to just make it fit into the surrounding region and into the causeway and the temple entrance leading to the pyramids. Now, we have pyramids sometimes that are like the Great Pyramid, and then we have much, much smaller ones, not so great, that have virtually fallen apart. They served as tombs. All the pyramids did. That's in contrast to the ziggurats of the land of Mesopotamia. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia served as temples. These were tombs for their various gods. There are around 100, a little bit more, I think, than 100 that are in Egypt, and they are all on the west side of the Nile River. They're on the west bank of the Nile because that's where the sun set. And so in their minds, that's where people's lives set. In fact, there was a euphemistic phrase. Instead of saying he died, you could say he went west. You know how we say sometimes he passed away? Well, where did he pass to? Well, the Egyptians would say he went west. And so most of the cities that we're going to see are on this east side of the Nile. The east side of the Nile is the land of the living, and the west side of the Nile, that's the land of the dead. The Old Kingdom will be followed by the first intermediate period that's going to stretch from 2181 all the way to 1991 BC. What brought the Old Kingdom to an end? Well, several reasons have been proposed. One is the fact that the last king of the Old Kingdom reigned for some 80 some odd years. Maybe he just reigned too long and everyone just got tired. Or perhaps it was, some have wondered if it was the pyramid building of the Great Pyramids, plural, not just the Great Pyramid, but all these pyramids that were built during the Old Kingdom. Did that exhaust the resources? We're not entirely sure. Some of the things that we can see, first of all, there are the entrance of Bedouins, outsiders coming into Egypt, and normally Egypt did not care to have outsiders coming in for any reason. But we have outsiders, some Bedouins coming in to Egypt. We also have the advent of pessimistic literature. Maybe as they saw things were going downhill, they begin to write about just the good old days and how we're not there anymore, and this pessimistic literature in Egypt. Next we come to the New Kingdom. Now the New Kingdom from 1991 to 1786 BC, spanning a period of just over 200 years. The Middle Kingdom, again we see a reunification in Egypt, and times are good again. The 11th dynasty in particular is that dynasty that's in power, if I understand the chronology correctly, when we look at the events that take place in the book of Genesis. Both in Abraham coming down into Egypt briefly, that's only the details of that are only given in Genesis, the latter part of chapter 12. But then again later on, actually 100 years or so later, we have the Joseph narrative of Joseph coming down into Egypt. Pharaoh Amenemhet III is one of the chief pharaohs of this period. Maybe, I like to think he might have been the pharaoh that was there in Joseph's day. We can't say for sure, and I certainly won't try to. But it's this pharaoh who digs an irrigation canal to the Fayum Depression. There's a low part of land. Today, there's a lake that occupies it, and he digs a canal from the Nile River to this depression so that when the Nile floods, it will fill up this area with fresh water. It will serve as a giant reservoir of water so that Egypt can be well watered during those dry times of the year. Or, can I be so bold, maybe if there's a 7-year period of drought, that they will be ready for any and all situations. He also undertakes a recording of the height of the Nile at different points. Now later on, the pharaohs would actually charge taxes, where you're going, depending on how much of your land gets flooded and how fertile that is and how close it is to Nile. If you're very close, then you might pay more taxes. Now, I don't mean you're paying money, you're actually paying goods, because the idea of money had not been invented yet, of coins or paper money. They didn't have those sorts of things. But you would pay, out of your material, you had to grow so much that went right to the pharaoh. And all of this begins to come around this time. And in Genesis chapter 37 through the end of the book of Genesis, in the Joseph narrative, we begin to read about how some of those things begin to come about, at least from the biblical perspective. We also have in a tomb painting, and what I'm picturing here is a artist restoration of the painting. If you look at the original, it's a bit harder to see. The colors have faded. We see that a lot of times when we look at Egyptian architecture or Egyptian tombs. We can see bits and pieces of the colors, but many times they have faded just from pollution or from time. Remember, we're looking at something 2,000 years old, and it shows during this time, again, Semitic peoples coming down into Egypt, and that reminds us once more of the Joseph story. In the Joseph story, we have the Israelites. Once Joseph has come to power, he's become the number 2 man in Egypt, and he arranges it where the Israelites might come and be allowed to settle in the land of Goshen. That is the area on the east side of Lower Egypt, that is the Delta region, marshy area, but the Israelites are permitted to settle here. Now, we're eventually going to have, doesn't happen immediately, I don't think, but eventually the Egyptians will grow suspicious of those Israelites that are living in their land. First of all, these Israelites are foreigners, and the Egyptians never really took too kindly to foreigners. You were either Egyptian or you were all those other people out there. And the Israelites, even though they came into Egypt, they retain their ethnic identity, and so they are considered by the Egyptians part of those other peoples. They are foreigners, but also they are shepherds. And among the Egyptians, shepherds are sort of people we don't want around here. We want the shepherds to go somewhere else, even if there were such a thing as Egyptian shepherds. There may have been, I don't know. But it was considered not all that respectable or trustworthy of a class. And that's how they thought of the Israelites. The Israelites were shepherds. Thirdly, they are there in the land of Goshen, which is the entryway into Egypt from anybody on the outside. That is, whenever you see an invader going to come, he's usually going to come either from the south, in Nubia to the south, or he's going to come through Goshen. And sure enough, we're going to see, and we'll look at this more in our next lecture, we're going to see a group come into Egypt known as the Hyksos, and they're going to come through Goshen. Fourthly, there's religious differences. And these come, I think these were held throughout, but when we come to the Exodus story, that is going to really come to the forefront, as we're going to see a battle of the gods, where the God of the Israelites will show that he is supreme over all of the gods of the Egyptians, even that God that they referred to as the Pharaoh. But we'll look at that next time.